Okay, this is chapter 23, which is a supplemental chapter to digestive, and we're going to talk about metabolism and nutrition. I'll be honest with you, probably 85% of this is old stuff, either from Biology 103 or stuff that we've covered in the chapter 22. So just as an intro, energy content, when you're talking about the diet, we measure this in terms of heat. So we're going to measure it in calories, which is a measure of heat. And what 1 calorie tells us is that's how much heat it would be required to raise the temperature of a gram of water by 1 degree. Kilocalorie is an actual unit of the calorie that we measure in the diet. And again, that's the amount of heat it's required to raise the temperature of 1 kilogram of water by 1 degree Celsius. Now, you studied metabolism deeply when you were in 103, and you know it's all the chemical reactions that are going on in the body. And those reactions are in a series called a metabolic pathway, which includes 4 processes. First, you have to take in food and break it down. All right, so you got to get the energy in the chemical bonds of molecules that you get from your diet, which is in the form of nutrients. Sometimes that is, of course, used to make ATP, which is your energy molecule. Then you convert that type of molecule from one source into another, and that we do that in order to synthesize reactions. Okay, then we have to make macromolecules. We have to synthesize proteins, polysaccharides, which are carbs, nucleic acids, and lipids, and then of course you have to break those down to break those macromolecules into their smaller components. Now, catabolism and anabolism are 2 phases of metabolism. Again, you've studied this already in 103. Catabolism is when you break it down. It's a series of reactions that breaks down the whole and releases the smaller parts. In that process, you release energy that can be used to drive other processes. And your body catabolizes 3 types of nutrient monomers in order to make ATP: glucose, fatty acids, and amino acids. Glucose is, of course, the breakdown of stored carbs. Every cell in the body is going to break down glucose. It is actually the preferred fuel for many cells, especially those in your brain and liver. And then you have fatty acids, which are mainly triglycerides. This is, of course, breaking down free fatty acids and glycerols. This kind of goes in separate pathways, and it can be used by the cells for other purposes as well, other than just energy. And then amino acids, of course, is what you get when you break down proteins. They also can proceed in separate pathways, or they can be used by the cell for other things as well. And then the other phase is anabolism, and this is when you're combining smaller molecules in order to build something up. We combine small molecules in order to get proteins, lipids, carbs, and nucleic acids. And this is just showing you some of that nutrient catabolism, and then this is showing you nutrient anabolism. All right, so when we talk about metabolism, we have 2 states or metabolic states, and these provide cells with energy at all times. Their states are going to differ based on whether they're feeding and how long it's been since they fed. And so these 2 are absorptive and post-absorptive. So absorptive happens right after you feed. This is from the time food enters the body or enters the bloodstream, lasts up to about 4 hours. Oxidation of the nutrient happens. Primarily glucose is going to give fuel to the cells. Glyconeogenesis stores excess glucose in your muscles and in your liver. Lipogenesis stores triglycerides in your adipocytes, which are your fat tissue, and your hepatocytes, that's the liver, of course. And then the protein synthesis provides structural materials for your cells. The hormone insulin that comes from the pancreas is going to help kind of facilitate most of this absorptive process. And of course, the release of that from the pancreas is triggered by an increase in blood glucose levels. So this is showing you the metabolic state. It goes through the oxidation of the nutrients to get ATP, breaking down the amino acids, and then, of course, what we do with those excess molecules and how we send those to the liver, and then, of course, the fats can be stored in the adipocytes. Now, the other state was post-absorptive state, and this is going to start once the nutrient absorption is complete. So this is going to be after about that 4-hour absorptive window is ended. Even though this differs from person to person, most of the time this is going to be late in the morning, after way after breakfast. Late in the afternoon, and then most of your nighttime, because again, you're not eating during those times. the anabolic process is going to slow or even stop some of these altogether. But the breakdown of proteins releases glucogenic amino acids into the blood. Ketogenesis in the liver cells convert fatty acids to ketone bodies. They also release those into the blood. And then gluconeogenesis and glyconeogenolysis in the hepatocytes are going to release glucose into the blood. So this is, again, to make sure that even though, because it's been a while since you've eaten, it's still, this post-absorptive state is still supplying the molecules to the bloodstream and to your tissues so that processes in the body can continue. Lipolysis in the adipocytes, of course, release fatty acids in the blood, and then oxidation of molecules like the fatty acids also provide cells with some fuel. We call this glucose sparing, which means that the cells are going to catabolize the newly delivered fatty acids over the glucose in an effort to conserve glucose for the cells of the nervous system. The brain really prefers glucose as its energy source. And so sometimes your body can do this glucose sparing so that the non-nervous system cells use the ketone bodies and the fatty acids and even amino acids for fuel. And that frees up your glucose for the nervous system. And then you have the pancreatic hormone glucagon, which is going to be released when your blood levels drop. And this is going to trigger glycogenolysis and gluconeogenesis, again, in an effort to try and supply cells with the fuel that they need to continue going. And this shows the metabolic states, the post-absorptive and that absorptive. All right, regulation of feeding. So we have some hormonal things that signal and stimulate feeding. We also have some neural signals that both stimulate and inhibit feeding. Both of these are found in the hypothalamus. There's two nuclei that control the variables associated with feeding. You have your satiety center and you have your hunger center. Obviously, your satiety center is going to inhibit your desire to eat because it gives you that sense of satisfaction and fullness. The hunger center is going to stimulate your desire to eat because this is what gives you those hunger pains. Some long-term regulation of feeding is hormonal. Leptin, which is a hormone that's produced by your fat cells. It stimulates that satiety center and inhibits the hunger center. Ghrelin is produced by your stomach cells. It stimulates neurons in the hunger center to promote hunger. So ghrelin is going to promote hunger. Leptin is going to inhibit that. The hunger center also can be stimulated when your leptin levels drop, and that also allows those hunger cells to become activated. Some short-term signals that can inhibit or stimulate feeding. Insulin, this is in response to feeding, kind of acts like leptin. It decreases your food intake. When food stretches your stomach wall, that's going to initiate a gastrointestinal hormone called cholecystokinin, and both of these stimulate your vagus nerve to indirectly suppress the hunger center. They also are going to decrease the release of your neurotransmitter that are related to hunger, the orexin and your neuropeptide Y. So both of these are going to decrease hunger and kind of decrease your food intake. Levels of certain things in the blood can stimulate or inhibit those centers. Hypoglycemia, low level of glucose in the blood, obviously is going to stimulate that hunger center. All right, metabolic rate. This is the total amount of energy that's expended by the body in order to power the body in all the processes. Heat's generated as a byproduct. This is a vital source of body heat for maintaining thermoregulation, which you know is your body temperature. We discussed earlier that we measure all of this in terms of heat or calories, and your metabolic rate can be indirectly determined by your oxygen consumption. So this is, of course, related to your amount of energy and heat production by the body. So BMR, or basal metabolic rate, is the minimum rate of metabolism that an individual has to have in order to keep the body running. Basically, it's your minimum energy cost of living for an awake individual. It continues to use energy even when your body's at rest. So the BMR is defined as these conditions have to be met. The person has not eaten for the 12 hours and had a good night of restful sleep. The person is not performing any physical activity and has not done any activity for at least an hour. The person is not under emotional or physical stress, and the temperature around the person is constant and comfortable. There are a lot of factors that affect your body's energy expenditure. So your BMR can vary, and it does this regularly. Thyroid hormones, growth hormones, physical activity, drugs, fever, nutritional status, all of those things affect your metabolic rate. You've probably heard the importance of eating breakfast. Really, really important to get this BMR going for the day. If you don't eat breakfast in the morning, your metabolic rate is going to be lower because you didn't jumpstart that system because of your nutritional status. It does vary between individuals. Some factors like gender and muscle mass obviously are going to come into play. You guys know everyone's metabolism, which is the BMR, is different. Some people have a really naturally high rate, basal rate, and then other people do not. Heat exchange, when heat moves, the gradients are present, and there's basically 4 mechanisms at which heat is exchanged within the environment. The first one is radiation, and this is when it transfers heat from one object to another through waves. Conduction is when heat is transferred with direct contact. 2 different objects are directly going to come in contact with each other. Convection is when heat travels through a liquid or a gas, and evaporation is when water changes from liquid to gas. Thermoregulation is regulating body temperature. You know, this is a major homeostatic variable that has to be maintained so that all of your other systems can do their jobs. Body temperature, core body temperature is about 99.5. This is the temperature of your deep body structures like liver and brain. It does fluctuate. That's just an average. It's accurately measured with a rectal thermometer. Your skin and oral thermometers can't measure core temperature accurately enough. And you learned back in the beginning of Anatomy 1 that body temperature is going to be kept and checked by a negative feedback loop. All right, let's look at nutrients because that's key important when we talk about energy and metabolism. These are things you get from food, and there's basically 5 categories for nutrients. Macronutrients, they're called macro because you need large amounts in your diet. Carbs, proteins, and lipids. You need a lot of those in your diet. Micronutrients, you need a lower amount in your diet. Vitamins and minerals are examples of micronutrients. And then essential nutrients are those that your body cannot produce. You have to get from a dietary source. So here's a great chart for all of your macronutrients and some examples and how much you need, and then of course what they do, their functions in the body. This is one of your objectives. We didn't put this in a note form because there's a great chart in your textbooks, and make sure that you do not skip over this. Micronutrients are your vitamins and minerals. They're not used as fuel, but they still play really important roles in physiological processes. You've got fat-soluble and water-soluble vitamins. There are 13 organic compounds to date that your body is required in order for it to function. Your fat-soluble or hydrophobic, they include vitamins A, D, E, and K. You need to know that. And water-soluble are hydrophilic. They have to be absorbed with water. We learned that back in the digestive system. And those are your vitamins B and C. So again, this is a review, but you do need to know the examples of the vitamins. And then... excuse me, that gets us to minerals. And this is any element other than carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen that's required by organisms. They are not used as fuel, but they are components in a lot of different processes. There are 7 major minerals that are required: calcium, chloride, magnesium, phosphorus, potassium, sodium, and sulfur. There are 10 trace, which means you only need a little bit of these in your diet: iodine, iron, and selenium. And then this gives you some examples of some foods that are mineral rich. Fruits, vegetables, dairy, and certain meats are going to give you some of these really important minerals. Okay, let's talk about cholesterol. This is a structural lipid. It is not used for fuel, but it is important for anabolic processes. It's modified to give us vitamin D, steroid, and bile salts. It also is really important in the structure of the plasma membrane. You remember that from 103. Cholesterol is in animal-based foods, meat and dairy, and the liver is actually capable of making 85% of your required cholesterol. So really, you only need about 15% of it to come in through your diet. The problem is most people have way more than 15% coming in through the diet. It's packaged with other lipids and proteins into a structure called lipoproteins. Lipoproteins are transporters. They provide transportation for the cholesterol and the other lipids in the bloodstream. And this is there's a different ratio from lipid to protein. So we're going to look at some different types of lipoproteins. You have VL, very low density, you have low density, and you have high density. The very low density have a higher percentage of lipids than proteins. They mainly transport triglycerides from the liver to the adipose tissue for storage. And they also sometimes go to muscle tissue for an immediate use as fuel. There's an enzyme, lipoprotein lipase, found on the plasma membranes of these cells, and it removes the triglycerides from these VLDLs, converts those to fatty acids, which can be absorbed by the cells where they're used for fuel. They do kind of resemble, or they reassemble those triglycerides. And then you have the LDLs, which is what is left over after VLDLs have unloaded their triglycerides. And these are low density proteins. They're the main mechanism by which cholesterol is delivered to body cells. When LDLs bind to a receptor, it triggers endocytosis, which is going to induce the uptake of cholesterol. Now, your VLDLs and your LDLs are considered bad cholesterol because they carry excess cholesterol to your peripheral cells. This can contribute to disease. The VLDLs and LDLs do not eliminate cholesterol from the body, excess cholesterol from the body. They store it in cells, and that's when it becomes a problem. Now, these are your good lipoproteins, your good cholesterols. These are high density. They're made in the liver. They're released into the bloodstream and the small intestine. What they do is they take excess lipids from the cells and they send them back to the liver. And in the liver, the cholesterol is absorbed and it's excreted from the body in the bile. Remember, the cholesterol we said helps make bile salts? Well, this is where that happens. So HDL is good because it carries that cholesterol back to the liver and then eventually excretes it from the body as a component of bile. So this is definitely a good thing. All right, that concludes Chapter 23 and Unit 4. Again, make sure that you look at that macronutrient chart in the text.